for EU policy. My name is Sergio Ampuria, and I'm a consultant from UNESCO, and I will be moderating this event. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that the location of the toilets are just outside of this room to the left, that you can find the network connections here written in the blackboard, and that we will, a warm welcome to our online participants. If you encounter any problems, please let us know in the chat. Also, before we begin, I would like to mention that the audio is coming from the bar on top and that the microphone is a bit sensitive. So I would just like to ask you to consider that when speaking. The meeting will be recorded for future references to ensure that we capture all the insights of this meeting. And we will take pictures. So if someone would not like to be taken part of this, please let us know and we'll respect your preference. And I would like to remind you that the discussion of this event will be the base for the development of a strategic and robust list of recommendations for EU policymakers from the Habitable project. We will take notes, which will be shared with you later in the event. And I hope we have a fruitful discussion despite the limited time available. So without further ado, we will now present a video from François Guémen, director of the UGO Observatory, saying a few words about the Habitable project and the workshop. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, good morning to you. Thanks a lot for attending this policy workshop here in Brussels. My name is François Guémen. I'm the director of the UGO Observatory at the University of Liège, and I'm also the PI for the Habitable project. And I am very sorry that I cannot be with you today in Brussels, but as we speak, I'm recording this video in a hotel room of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, where I'm about to board in a few hours on a vessel of the French Navy for a crossing of the Atlantic. So I'm afraid this is a very good reason why I cannot be with you in Brussels today. However, I wanted to share with you some points that seem really important to me and important to convey regarding the project itself. Habitable is the most important project, at least in terms of funding, that was ever funded by the European Commission on the topic of climate-induced migration. And the project takes a rather original approach because unlike other projects that have often, compiled case studies or tried to make quantitative projections on the basis of climate models and demographic data, here in this project, we really try and understand at a household level what are the drivers leading to the migration decision. In other words, what makes people stay or leave? And for this, we use the concept of habitability. We try and define how households define whether or not the place where they live is still inhabitable. How do we do this? We do this through a mix of quantitative and qualitative methods, household surveys for quantitative methods, but also innovative methods such as fuzzy cognitive mapping when it comes to qualitative methods. And this blending of methods really allows us to get a clearer idea of how people make their decision. And I think that the number one finding, and I think that is the one that is perhaps the most policy relevant, is that people make their decision to leave or to stay primarily on the basis of their perceptions of climate impacts. And obviously, the way we perceive things is not always the way things are. And I think this is a fundamental difference that we highlight in the project. Typically, most policies on climate change and adaptation policies in particular are based on climate model. And very often these climate models have tried to define habitability threshold on the basis of temperature or humidity level. We've said this place will no longer be inhabitable when temperature will reach a certain amount of degrees. What we show in Habitable is that it doesn't work like that, and that people actually might be leaving before that threshold is reached, or they might be staying even after that threshold is reached, because people define their own habitability threshold, and this threshold is based on their perceptions, on their subjective perceptions of climate impacts, and not on objective realities, on observations. And I think this is a fundamental difference to take into account when we design climate policies and adaptation policies. And in particular in the project, we highlight the concept of social tipping point. That is the fact that depending on their resilience level, two different groups, two different populations might actually experience climate impacts in a very different way. That explains why sometimes small climate impacts might induce major social transformation, major migration flows, or potentially political instability, whereas in other situations, when the resilience level is much higher, some massive impacts of climate change can actually result in very little social change because the society, because the group is highly resilient. We come to the conclusion, therefore, that it is not possible to define a kind of one-size-fits-all habitability threshold, and that we need to take into account those subjective perceptions in order to be able to define when the social tipping point will be reached or not. And unlike climate tipping points that can be defined broadly, I would say, with a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, the social tipping point is highly dependent upon the context, highly dependent upon the resilience of the society. On this basis, we've elaborated some scenarios and some models, and those are the scenarios and models that we will also be discussing with you. But really, what I want to highlight today is the importance to take into account perceptions and not objective realities, because people make their decisions on the basis of perceptions. And I think that could help us get a much better understanding of the migration flows that are likely to happen in the future, and to move away from a very deterministic narrative that would see climate change as a new factor of migration chaos, of migration waves. And the public debate has been dominated in recent years by this narrative, and I'm afraid this is a narrative that will be pushing for extreme right and for the closing of the borders. And I'm afraid that this narrative might have very detrimental consequences also for migration and asylum policies today. Therefore, I really hope that with this project, we'll be able to create a more nuanced, a finer narrative that will also show us about the ways that we can actually organize and manage such migration so that we move away from this deterministic narrative of migration chaos. But for this, of course, we will need you, policymakers, and this is the reason why meetings like the one of today are so important, so that we can really work with you to inform the policies and to reflect on the way policies can actually incorporate scientific results. And I think this is really something that is badly needed at the moment. My apologies again that I cannot be with you. I'll be training the new recruits of the French Navy on the boat for the next 10 days, but I have no doubt that the meeting of today will be extremely fruitful, and I want to thank my colleagues at Adelphi for organizing it. Thanks a lot, and have a good workshop.
Perfect. We will now begin session one. Key takeaways for policymakers from Habitable, which will be introduced and moderated by Marie Leroy, Care France coordinator for the Habitable project. So, Marie.
Yes, I'm just thinking I may go over there because a lot of you, I'm just trying to find the right angle to be able to talk to all of you and online as well, 12 people online. So good morning, everyone. My name is Marie Leroy. I work for Care International, which is an NGO, and we are part of this Habitable Consortium. So I will be moderating this panel today. Maybe because we're quite a small group, we were thinking that it would be good to go for a round of introductions. So if you can just each give us your name, title, organization, just to know, so that we all know who is around the table. Cindy, would you like to start?
Sure. Good morning, all. My name is Roisin Drury. I work for the European Union Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, so FPI. We, within the unit I work in, we work on climate, peace, and security. So as part of that, I'm very interested to engage with today's kind of topic, because it's something that is obviously inextricably linked to what we're doing in terms of climate conflict fragility. So while we do not have let's say, a central mandate on migration and displacement, I think you're probably familiar with the constellation of EU actors working on those themes. Certainly, the kind of climate, peace, security nexus is of great interest. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I am Sayed Asnin.
Sorry, can you speak a bit louder?
Okay,
I
I am Sayed Asnin. I am originally from Afghanistan. Lived experience of forced migration, and I'm president of UNIRE, which is the Italian National Union of Refugees and Exiles, a refugee-led organization, and also co-founder of European Coalition of Migrants and Refugees, which is another umbrella network of refugee and migrant communities in Europe, based here in Brussels. So I'm here, glad to be here and to share perspective of people with lived experience, also people that they are displaced due to climate change, and Afghanistan is one of the countries which is really exposed to climate change. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lila Ronquenes. I'm a climate project officer for Care France, working on Habitable as well on the stakeholder engagement.
Hi everyone, my name is Raissa Noël. I'm from IGAD. I represent IGAD in the context of the cooperation between IGAD and the EU.
Hi everyone, I'm Susanna Melda. I just moved to Brussels this week. I'm I know any of you from this topic before. So glad to be back.
Morning, my name is Ahmad Ubar. I work as a advisor. I'm here to present the commercial of
My name is Antonio Leon, and I work for the Red Cross EU office in Brussels. Our office represents 27 Red Cross national society of the European Union, plus Norwegian Red Cross, Atlantic Red Cross, and the International Federation of the Red Cross.
Morning, I'm Valerie Dura. I'm the operations manager for ODI Europe, so you might be more familiar with the overseas development series. I'm based in Brussels.
My name is Vanessa. I'm from the Mission of Thailand to the EU. My past experience was that I was the negotiator of the Global Compact on Migration back in 2018. So happy to be here to be part of this project, especially to be the part of the EU decision-making process.
Good morning, everyone. I am Isabel Steiler. I am part of the Liège University and I'm working in communication in the HABITABLE.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Kelly. I'm an advisor at Adelphi and climate policy program. We're working on developing scenarios for the scenario narratives for the Habitable project. So I'm very happy to be here.
Microphone dead center here.
Yeah.
I'm Toby Bernstein from Adelphi, also an advisor and working with Emily.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Diogo Serraglio, research analyst at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research in Germany, working on climate-induced migration and also part of the Habitable project.
Hi everyone, I'm Gianfranco Nocera. I'm a researcher in international law. I'm working in Sapienza University of Rome and I work in the Habitable project on the legal and policy analysis.
So good morning everyone, I am Pier Francesco Bridge.
and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in international law at Sapienza University of Rome, and I work with the Working Package 6 team for the HABITABLE project.
Okay, and we have quite a few people online, so I'm happy to give the floor if people online want to introduce themselves as well. Just trying to be fair between those being here and those being away.
Okay, so can I go?
Go ahead, Mumini. I recognize your voice. I don't see you, but I recognize your voice. Yes.
Can you see me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so my name is Mumuni Abu, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Regional Institute for Population Studies, University of Ghana. And I'm also the country lead on the Habitable project. And my area of specialty is population health, migration, and human environment. And I'm very happy to be with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mumini. Others participants online, please feel free to open your microphone and introduce yourself if you wish.
Yes, hello, can you hear me? Yes?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yes, sorry for not having my camera on, but my name is Sade Kowo, and I'm a colleague of Royshins in the room. I work for the European External Action Service covering climate and security. So obviously this question of migration is an important part of that agenda. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Anna, did you want to go next? I see you open your camera.
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Anna Rozinska, and I work at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in the Demography and Migration Unit, and I am interested in the intersection of migration and environmental processes. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Christoph, I see your camera. Please go ahead.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm a colleague of Anya, here in Ispra, Italy, working for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and mostly on the portfolio of climate migration. So thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to be online here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna follow from Christoph and Anya. I'm a colleague of theirs working at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and I'm also working on climate and migration. Over.
Thank you, Teresa. Have anyone else? If you're feeling shy, you can also just put your name and title in the chat. Okay, I guess that's it for now. Well, I think it's very exciting to see such a diverse group and a real wealth of expertise around the table, and seeing that we have people that are more involved in the policy making, others that are representing more affected communities, and I think we'll have a really rich dialogue today. We really hope this will be a conversation rather than a top-down conference from our side, so we'll have different moments for interaction. It's very important for us as part of this project we think the project can really reach its full potential if we have this interaction with a range of stakeholders, including policymakers. And one of our main goals from the research is to be able to provide insights and evidence in support for better informed policymaking. So we want this to be really a back and forth process where we can provide some evidence and data and hear back from you what you find useful and relevant, and then further fine-tune our products from the project. I also would like to mention that we are interacting closely with the affected communities in the 5 countries of research. So the 5 countries, we didn't mention that yet, but they are Ghana, Mali, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa, and Thailand. And we have really thrived with this project so that the community members are not only respondents to our research methods, but they're also actual participants, and we're trying to engage a conversation with them throughout the project. As an example, we're organizing now and in the coming months in-country community events in each of the countries of the research to discuss also the findings with the communities. And we really want this research process to be as participatory and inclusive as possible. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is also to be able to convey the very specific needs and interests of those most affected to you as policymakers, researchers, and practitioners. So for this first session, we'll be sharing with you some preliminary findings of the project. I just want to clarify that this project is ongoing until the end of the calendar year. So we will have to wait until November, December to have the final body of research and the final findings. But we're very happy to share some preliminary findings and reflections today. For the first session, we'll be breaking into two moments. One moment which is more focusing on national level evidence and policy implications. And then we will broaden the scope and discuss about EU level and international policy implications. So without further ado, we'll first give the floor to our colleague, Dr. Mumuni Abu from University of Ghana, who just introduced himself. And he will share some preliminary findings and analysis from the data conducted in Ghana specifically. So please, Mumuni, the floor is yours.
All right, so thank you all once again, and I'll be sharing some preliminary findings from so far the work we've done in Ghana. So I'll first of all want to give a brief context in terms of the areas that we worked in Ghana. We basically work in two regions. We have what we call the Volta region and also the Northern region. The Volta region has a coastal kind of ecological setting, whilst the Northern region has a Guinea savanna characteristics. So these are quite distinct regions, and these are also the regions that are highly impacted in terms of climate-related issues. So that is one of the reasons why we selected these areas. The primary occupation of the populations within these areas, if you take the Volta Delta, for instance, they are basically farmers and fishers. So they are engaged in agricultural activities. And then it is the same for the Savannah region. And within the Volta region, they have two main seasons of rainfall. We have what we call the peak season, which is usually around this time, all the way from April, and then it goes all the way to July. We have a little break, and then they have the minor season between September, October, and then it dwindles around November. Within the Northern region, they have a unimodal kind of pattern. So they have one major season, and then after that, you don't really get enough rainfall to be able to do or engage in any agricultural activity. These two geographical locations that we also selected for this exercise also has very distinct gender norms. Even though both are patriarchal kind of society, there are stronger gender norms within the Northern region compared to that of the Volta region. There is a little bit of flexibility where women are able to assume certain responsibilities within the Volta region as compared to how strong these are within the Volta region. So the Northern region. So we wanted to also understand some of these issues within the areas. And generally, these are very high level fertility areas. So in terms of the average number of children per woman within these particular areas, their statistics is far above that of the national average. So in the Northern region, you are talking of an average of about 5. And also within the Volta Delta, the Volta region, you are talking of average of around 4. Meanwhile, the national average currently is around 3.9 children per woman. So because of these characteristics, that is the reason why we chose these areas. These are also areas that are noted from all our census data in terms of high out migration to other areas within the country. And so it fits very well in terms of the kind of work that we wanted to do. So just to share one basic kind of finding with you, we try as much as possible to look at some of the losses that people probably suffer as a result of climate-related shocks within these particular areas. There are several reports that once you have climate events hitting these areas, events such as floods, droughts, and those things, then people are most likely to lose a number of things. We have ways of objectively maybe measuring them, but as much as possible, we also want to listen to these people because it is what they believe they've lost that really triggers some of the actions that they take within their communities. And in terms of engaging with them, we realized that over the last 6 years, there has been increasing report in terms of losses associated with climate-related issues. These are areas that experience both floods and drought. The northern region, for instance, is very close to the Sahel. So you may only be thinking of an area where they should be hit more with issues associated with drought. But this is also an area that experiences massive floods, usually sometime in the year around between September, October, because at that time, there has been massive rainfall, usually around Burkina Bay area. And so once the Burkina Bay area opens their Bagre Dam, we have issues associated with flooding also within these areas. Now, if you look at the graph, you realize that from 2018, there has been that increasing trend in terms of losses associated with some of these climatic shocks. And one of the highest one that was recorded has to do with drought. And that was in 2021. And even when you also check in 2023. And this is a kind of worry because if people are hit by some of these events, we also want to find out whether these losses that they go through as a result of these climatic shocks equally trigger some form of migration within this particular area. So because of that, we try to also find out the key factors affecting out migration from the areas in which we worked. And I know we all know by now that if you talk to community members, the key driver that comes out is economic. Nobody goes into some of these climate-related issues that we usually talk about. And if you want to go direct with the climate-related issues, you realize that the proportion that usually report directly that they migrated as a result of maybe drought, flood, erratic rainfall, or heat wave is just a small proportion. Most of them barely less than 5%. But when you try to go behind that economic reason, because these are agrarian communities, so we tried as much as possible to go behind some of the economic reasons to find out what exactly is triggering this migration from this area. And then we realized that issues associated with drought, issues associated with flood, heat waves, and erratic rainfall were actually also contributing to some of these drivers. So once you go behind some of these economic reasons, then you are able to get a significant proportion, quite related to close to sometimes around 40%, because they tell you it's agriculture and you want to find out economic, what livelihood activity do they engage in? Is the agricultural activity that has been hit? And so probably that is what led to the kind of migration that they embark on. So these are some of the things that we observed from our data. In fact, there is another level of analysis that we have engaged in that I'm not showing on these slides, but that has to do with trying to see the kind of shocks that they reported, whether these shocks really drive migration. And what we observed was that even though a significant proportion of them indicated that drought is something that really affects them, it doesn't really trigger that level of migration. So people are affected by drought, but they are still living in those kind of conditions. So it goes back to what Francois Gemin indicated. So people may experience some of these shocks and may not necessarily trigger the migrations that we all anticipate to see, because they find ways of adapting, and so sometimes due to some cultural reasons and some kind of attachments that these people have for their communities, they still want to be there. And so you may have the shocks, but it's not everybody that moves. One thing that we need to begin to look at is probably the morbidity and mortalities associated with some of these people who decide to stay, and what exactly is also happening to some of these people. Now let's have a look at some kind of policy implications that we have in mind. So we think, yes, if you look at some of the issues or some of the findings that we are getting, we think we really need to focus in terms of building the resilience of communities to climate shocks. So these shocks are there, and the livelihood activities of these people are climate sensitive. Most of the areas that we've worked in, those who are engaged in agriculture, don't have any kind of meaningful irrigation facility to be able to really do, let's say, dry season kind of farming. So these are things that we need to look into and to propose, so that policymakers could actually put certain things in place to ensure that some of these people have a decent kind of life. And then we also observe that the migration decision, yes, even though you have some of these economic reasons coming up, there is also some of the social dynamics and also some of the climate-related issues that are really driving.
I don't know. You can ask online. If you could hear the room.
Are other people still hearing us? We're just trying to find out if who's having the connection issue, if it's our room or the room. People online, are you still hearing?
I hear the room. I no longer hear Dr. Abu.
Let's his connection. We'll wait a few seconds to see.
Otherwise, it was the final slide.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we'll ask Mumuni. I think he will reconnect. I just took the opportunity of this slide break to mention that so we're hearing to Mumuni, we'll be hearing to another brief presentation, and then we'll open for discussion and questions. So if you have questions from Mumuni, please keep them aside, and after the next presentation, we'll take them. Okay, I guess. See if Mumuni comes back. But in the meantime, I will introduce. Sorry, I see that you joined while we were having the session. We had a round of introductions before, so if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, of course. My name is Aya Kasasa. I'm the expert in charge of migration.
So sorry, unfortunately, my network dropped.
Oh.
And I think I was at the conclusion section when my network dropped. So I was talking about the drought tolerant issue.
Yes, if you want to give your final points and concluding remarks, I think we missed that.
Oh.
Yeah, no, he's there.
He's here, but he's frozen.
It's an effective way of creating intrigue around.
Yeah.
The most important point is
Exactly.
This is how we fix it.
He's nodding, so I don't know if you want to address him. Can you hear us?
Can you hear us, Mumuni, now? I think we'll
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
now we can hear you. Please, can go on.
Yes, so, well, if you can hear me, I was just talking about we paying attention to some of these losses associated with droughts and trying to see how best we can improve on the resilience of communities, especially towards droughts, because it's something that most of them experience, but it doesn't also lead to the kind of migration that maybe we all anticipate. So I would like to end here, and then I'm sure there will be some questions, and maybe we'll be able to go into details. Sorry about the network challenges, but you should understand by now. Thank you.
No worries, Mumuni, that happens. And it was really, really insightful presentation. As I mentioned, while you were, when we dropped, when the network dropped, we'll be hearing from Diogo, and then we'll open the floor for discussions and questions. So I'm sure there will be interesting remarks after your presentation. I'll give back the floor to our colleague who was introducing herself.
Yes, hello. My name is Aya. I'm the expert in charge of migration and urbanizations at the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So now that we had this very nice, I think, very concrete zoom in into the work in Ghana, we'll zoom out a little bit with an intervention from Dr. Diogo Seraglio from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Studies, who will give us some insights of some of the preliminary findings across the 5 countries of research.
Thank you, Mahi.
Check if they can hear you.
Yeah. Colleagues online, can you hear me? You guys can hear me, right?
No, but I think it doesn't really pick up. I think you might need to take like a step back. Because there's like a
Here, maybe. Okay, great. Sorry. Yeah, so good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Diogo. Working together with Julia Blocha at PEAK. And at PEAK, we work on qualitative data analysis. So we are working with semi-structured interviews. And in the next slide, I just bring a quick overview or outline of our presentation. So today we aim to bring some insights and reflections on 3 main topics so that we can nourish the discussions afterwards. So the first one is how people living in climate vulnerable areas view or perceive the impacts of climate change, followed by what is the role of migration among adaptation strategies, and then trying to link this a little bit to current developments in national policies and legal frameworks. But before that, I would like just to bring some information on our method. So as François Germain mentioned, we are a consortium, we are different research institutes, universities and think tanks working with different research questions and different methods. So at PEAK, our main research question is what is the place of migration among local level response strategies, meaning that we focus mostly on micro and meso level coping strategies and adaptation solutions, but that also means that we also give attention to the medium and long-term effects of these strategies to see or to try to understand if these strategies are positive or negative, and that would lead to maladaptation, for instance. So our method, we were conducting semi-structured interviews. Why semi-structured interviews? That enable us to get some information that is comparable among countries, but also some open questions where we get details and we are able to better understand social context, norms, social cultural norms. We have a handbook available at Habitable website. So if you guys are interested to get to know a little bit better from our methodology, you can just have access to this document. In the next slide, we have an overview of our sample. So as Mahi mentioned, we work with 5 primary countries. So we conducted research in Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Mali, and Thailand. And at peak, we also had a secondary case country, that is South Africa. And we were always conducting interviews, both in origin areas or sending areas and destination areas with migrants, households with migrant and non-migrant experience, and then talking to migrants in destination area. Here you see some information from the interviews conducted by country teams, like Professor Mumuni in Ghana. Details come in the next slides. And this is one of the largest, just a quick observation, this is one of the our database is one of the largest databases on qualitative data. And this is going to be available very soon online for, it's going to be an open access platform, and everybody will have access to our information. So addressing the first point, how do people in climate vulnerable areas view the impacts of climate change in their lives and livelihoods? Our sample, we see that our interviewees, they are affected by different environmental hazards that are somehow interdependent. So we notice or we observe that drought and lack of rainfall were reported or mentioned as the most frequent environmental hazards, together with infestation, flooding, landslides, and so on. And these are blamed for livestock death, decrease in crop production, food insecurity, decreased income, among others. So overall, our interviewees, they acknowledge that environmental problems affect their lives and livelihoods. In the next slide, this was like what I was just bringing, like when we are talking about like how they perceive, we have a set of questions. And then our first question was, what is the main or greatest hazard experience? And here you can see, like in this cloud, that is like drought, and then rainfall, and then like in a secondary way, like or indirect way, they are like referring like, okay, this is causing food insecurity and etc. In the next slide, combined with the greatest environmental hazard, we wanted to know like factors that made the situation worse. So combined with environmental hazard, they are often like reporting that they lost their jobs, or there was an increase or high food prices. They were facing health issues, challenges in paying like school fees, and this combined with environmental hazard would also change their overall well-being. And as Professor Mumuni mentioned, when it comes to well-being, they mostly perceive, they don't see like the environmental driver like directly. So like environmental shocks, they serve, or they seem to be like an indirect catalyst, and they amplify pre-existing vulnerabilities that eventually will drive the migration decisions. So when they were talking about their well-being, they mostly related to economic challenges. And then these economic challenges combined with this indirect catalyst, like food insecurity, like challenges in paying the school fee, will build the scenario, okay, like we need to migrate, or we need to migrate or not. And again, just as mentioned in the previous presentation, like economic reasons or motivations take a preference, followed by educational aspiration as primary migration drivers of migration. In the next slide, we address then the second point, what is the role of migration among coping strategies and adaptation solutions. And what we see is that migration is just one strategy among many others to cope with this vulnerable scenario. So together, okay, like we may migrate, but we may also like skip meals. We may take take out loans, or most commonly they are just they are changing their agricultural practices. And these are slightly different in each community. Migration is frequently seen as a positive phenomenon, especially for those who are receiving both financial and social remittances. And that enables, that is also a way to facilitate income diversification. But on the other hand, we also notice in our sample, the maladaptive potential of migration. So it's very common in our sample to see that we have households with experience in migration, migrant in the urban area faces precarious conditions, very often is not able to send remittance or money back to the ones who were left behind. And that also like leads to an extra burden for the household. So kids are quitting school, like women, besides being in charge of the house, chores, fetching water, like in wood, firewood, etc. They are now also taking responsibilities in terms of agriculture, and so on. And what we see is that migration, the decision to migrate is always being reevaluated. So they are always considering all these different social conditions and reevaluating, okay, like should I return or should I continue here? Or it may be like we are just talking about like seasonal migration, so they are changing like time of migration and so on. In the next slide, and this is what we have been working on at the moment, on the preconditions for adaptive migration. So as I was saying, we have like limited access to resources that also that is coupled with limited adaptation capacity. So we usually have migration for according to them, economic reasons. And this migration can be adaptive, successful, or can be erosive, both in the destination area and also in the origin area. And we have some factors that will hinder or facilitate migration. And these include, for instance, primary occupation, household composition, environmental hazards, and also non-environmental shocks over time. So health issues, job loss, challenges in paying school fees, and so on. In the next slide, we still have other factors that are worth mentioning. So we also have gender perspective. As Mumuni said, the average household size, dependency ratio, educational aspirations. So this combination of social conditions or socioeconomic situation combined with environmental repeated shocks, environmental shocks, will lead to the decision or the need to migrate or not. So this is what we have been working on. And in my last slide, I just bring some information on current developments on policies and legal frameworks at the national level. So when we were conducting these interviews, we also interviewed community leaders, and we were able to identify some common challenges in these communities. So for instance, most of them face water management issues, they struggle with irrigation, they have infrastructure problems like roads, access to schools or like health facilities. And as I was saying, these are all like contributing, like are amplifying, contributing like to the socioeconomic situation, and combined with environmental shocks that will make migration happen like in faster. So we were bringing like these common challenges to policies and legal frameworks at the national level. So we had a mapping exercise in these countries. We were focusing mostly like in 4 different domestic agendas, like human mobility, climate change, disaster management, and sustainable development. So we were checking like migration laws, refugee decrees, like national adaptation plans and disease, evacuation plans, etc., and always trying to link. Okay, there's an acknowledgement of the distinct dimensions of human mobility in the context of climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters, and if these were linked to the challenges identified in the communities. And what we see from this mapping exercise, this was not exhaustive, and we were just considering the policies addressing or acknowledging the topic, is that there's a growing acknowledgement of the topic in national policies and legal frameworks in these countries. And sometimes we find provisions to address it, but most of the times, these provisions, they do not address these specific conditions of vulnerability. So they are not linked to water management or irrigation or like education or health. So there is a kind of a gap between like what happens and what is needed at the local level and what is done at the national level. A second observation is that most of these acknowledgements, they are related to environmental drivers. So most acknowledgements are identified in climate and disaster policies and legal frameworks, and related to adaptation measures or like evacuation strategies, temporary shelters, and so on. And rather than like in the human mobility governance. So we don't see like migration policies or including like regular or providing for regular migration pathways, nor like maybe like refugee law, bringing an extended definition of refugee and so on. So therefore, we need to not only recognize the topic or acknowledge, but have specific provisions. Also considering the local needs. And a very last point is that at the regional level, especially we are mostly working, we have Thailand, but we are also working with the IGAD and ECOWAS region. At the regional level, we see already guidance on how to address, on how to have like migration policies or frameworks addressing the climate change and mobility nexus. And these can be useful for, at the national level for effective responses. So these are some of our inputs. I hope these were helpful. I thank you very much for your attention and very much looking forward to the discussions afterwards. Thank you.
So much, Diogo. I think it's really fascinating the number of insights and findings that you could bring to the table. We'll be opening the floor for discussion and questions, but I will take the privilege of being moderating to ask the first question myself. I was curious, you mentioned gender as one of the factors affecting the climate migration decision-making. I was curious if you could tell us a little bit more about how that enters into play according to the data that you looked at.
Okay, thanks, Marie. Well, when it comes to gender, we know that gender gender dimension has a major impact on how people perceive and also on how they are able to react to the impacts of climate change. So in our data set, we can clearly see that, for instance, women as food producers, they are usually the ones left behind. So because of social cultural norms, they are, in addition to the house chores, having like early marriages, like very often they are also in charge of crop production or like taking care of livestock. They also face difficulties or challenges like when it comes to access to education, especially because of these patriarchal norms or social cultural norms. And they have very limited decision-making power or participation like in decision-making processes. And this is very clear in our data set. So African countries, such as Mali and Ghana, we really see the role of cultural norms and how limited women participation in decision-making processes is. But on the other hand, in Thailand, for instance, we see that women have more space for decision-making processes, and that means that they have more, they are more aware of the impacts of climate change and the role of migration in this whole context. So it really depends. Gender like really influences capabilities to react and to change or change their own conditions. And what is like also very interesting from our data set is the masculinity aspect of gender, because of these social or social cultural norms also imply that is the young man migrating and very often to very precarious situations. So in Mali, we have young men going to gold mines, living, struggling like to survive and also to send money back home. And also like in Thailand, we see examples of international migration where guys are struggling abroad. So yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Diogo. I think we'll take 10 to 15 minutes for the discussion. I'm just looking at my colleagues. I don't know if we're on track with the time of the event overall.
10:24. Yes.
And we have until
11:15. So we have 45 minutes.
Awesome.
10
For the whole
minutes.
session.
Yeah,
Right. Okay. Okay, we'll take 10 minutes for the discussion now, and then we'll hear from the national perspective. So please raise your hand physically or virtually, and we'll take your questions or comments to get commented. And just speak out loud for the.
Sure. Can you hear me online?
Yes, I can.
Great. So it's a question for both of you. Thank you both. I think the kind of the juxtaposition of the two is really useful. And you know what we come up against consistently, I think all of us when looking at this vast subject, is the complexity of the causal pathways and how difficult it is to frame interventions and develop coherent policy, right, while allowing it to be tailored to all of the particularities of each context. So, Mumuni, you kind of indicated one of the issues around, well, awareness of communities, even around what is the immediate cause versus the more long-term driver of migration and displacement. And so I wanted to know from you whether you felt that there is an element of kind of awareness raising that needs to be supported, accompaniment, if you like, of communities in these processes, and what your kind of thoughts were around how that needs to look, because it's clear that, you know, one sensitization meeting with the community is probably not going to deal with the vast layers of analysis that are needed. And then for you, Diogo, I wanted to ask, you know, if you had, well, both of you, but on the more policy development and the policy support side, because you referenced the fact that many of these frameworks, which we and many others support, are not necessarily articulated and connected. So we provide policy support to crisis response and early warning systems and water management, and all of this gets discussed at capital level, but the linkages, even at capital level, are quite tenuous, and as you move down into regions, are even weaker often. So what your kind of initial thoughts, and I'm aware that the project hasn't yet reached its conclusion, but your initial thoughts around how policy support for that kind of more joined up thinking could look.
Thank
Okay.
you so much. We can take the answer right away. Yeah, Mumuni, please go ahead.
All right. So in terms of awareness raising maybe within these communities because of some of the findings that we had currently, we've already had some kind of a community sensitization within these study areas. So we have what we call exhibition. So basically what we did was some of the findings that we had, the scientific findings, we packaged it in a form of a drama. And also the drama, what we did was to engage with a basic school within the study communities. And then we train these school children to be able to communicate the message to the larger community, because the children more or less become our ambassadors in terms of how best to engage with these communities. So we did this, I think, just a month ago, and I'm still in touch with the school, because there are other engagements that we want to have with this kind of school, so that most of the children will become more or less climate ambassadors within these communities to be able to get the message down. And then we have also been able to engage the district assembly, that is where policies emanates. And then we had some kind of awareness raising with them, and it was a kind of a workshop. Most of them appreciated what we did. We had the district development planners as part of it. And as an institute, because we are more into demographic issues, we had to commit to support some of these district assemblies in terms of their population projections and how to integrate some of these climate-related issues into their budget. And we believe once that is done, then government will be able to take it up from that particular level. So at the moment, this is the kind of awareness that we have created in our small way. But we think as the project progresses to the end, maybe there will be other engagements that we will have with some of these communities. Thank you.
If I may just add to that, thank you so much, Mumi. And we all also, so this is a really concrete and great example from Ghana, and from the different types of the research we've been discussing with the countries, so the institutions that are in the country, to identify what would be the best way to convey the findings and some recommendations from the research to the local communities. Most of the time it will be in the form of visual arts. Like in this case, it was theater. In other cases, it may be music and dance, just finding the right way to convey the messages. And on top of that, we've also been working on a graphic novel, which is, I think, a way to, as you said, having a one-time event or sensitization is usually not sufficient. Having the graphic novel is a way to also be able to include into the conversation people that sometimes can't read or write or can. So it's a graphic that has text, just images showing the trajectory of specific migrants and individuals. And it's a way also to keep one of the products that stay and keep being circulated after the project, as opposed to one-time event, which has other benefits, but it's just important. But by having this visual graphics, we can share them and circulate them and use them in different ways. So I just added that to this response.
Yeah, thanks, Momini. Thanks, Mahi. And maybe just complementing Momini's answer. I also had a chance to participate in the exhibition that took place in Ghana, and it was very interesting to see that district authorities, like sometimes they are not even aware of their own socioeconomic conditions or situations. So there's like a huge contribution from Habitable in this regard to bring all this information and let them aware like of their own socioeconomic situation. And maybe addressing the second question on policy development and lack of articulation. It is very clear in these countries that we are studying or focusing on, and this is not something happening only in these countries, but in most of countries, we see a clear lack of horizontal and vertical coherence, right? So when I'm talking about like horizontal coherence, we see that migration agenda may work on the topic. Climate agenda may also work on the topic or acknowledge the topic. Disaster also, sustainable development. And they always like do it like on a different way. They are not coordinated. They are not talking to each other. So sometimes they are not even aware of what they are like discussing like in the next door, you know. And this makes the challenge like the whole thing even more challenging because okay, like so we have like this lack of coordination at the national level and how to ensure to bring these like to the province level and to the district level. Also acknowledging that all these departments at the national level are not even really aware of what are like the needs of the local community or like the households and etc. And there's also we also notice this capacity building, lack of capacity building, lack of financial terms, like to try to better work with the topic. And in this regard, we are also having some policy dialogues within Habitable and trying to show like to national authorities all these gaps and challenges related like, regarding the topic.
Does it answer your questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think integrated policy is just going to be one of those, you know, universal and ever-present challenges, and I'm very interested to see how we can find, you know, in more fragile contexts, find entry points and ways of getting that message across that this challenge can only be dealt with in that way. So yeah, very interested to hear as the conclusions progress.
Yes, well, thanks a lot. Very interesting findings. One point you made, Joe, about migration policies. I mean, we see that globally, I think just in those countries. I guess one explanation can be that most of those movements are internal and migration policies are more looking at international migration. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned regular pathways. Did you have any particular suggestions in mind there? Maybe also thinking about, internal movements, but also south-south. Is that outside of regional free movement areas is also quite a challenge. So just to see if you have any ideas there.
Yeah, thanks, Susanne, for your comment. So indeed, when we look our sample, we are mostly talking about internal migration, right? Except Thailand, that has a kind of a different scenario. We are always talking about rural and urban migration, and you are right. Maybe we don't have the specific provisions because when we are talking about migration, we are mostly talking about cross-border movements, and then in the African context. That would happen with pastoralists, for instance, and then when we go to IGAD, we have like the pastoralist framework, trying to address this a little bit. But what we identified, and this is in Mali, for instance, they have a draft law on internal displacement. But then when you go like to the provisions, you see that there's a kind of a lack of coherence in terms of terminology, you know. They are implying that migration is international and like population movements within national borders would be then displacement. So we have some kind of initiatives. We don't really know if these policies will pass or not. But again, when we look at the provisions from IGAD, for instance, and also ECOWAS, in addition to having these free movement protocols that would address cross-border movements, there are some guidance on how to have like population movements regulation at the national level.
Thank you very much. Actually, your answer just partially answer my questions because as I see the countries of examples, it's quite concentrated in African countries, and then you have Thailand. And I would like just to ask you your methodology when discussing with the authorities or persons involved, because in some countries the situation is very complex as a country of destination, transit, and origin. And in Thailand, we are all of that status in terms of cross-border migration and internal migration. What is your main focus of the project and the way that you choose countries to participate in the project?
Okay. Well, this is I started participating in the project like in the middle of the process, so I don't really have the answer like about the criteria like for the country selections. Maybe Mumuni can support on that.
He's nodding. You can let him come in. He's nodding. He's ready.
I wasn't really involved in the selection of countries, but I think it was all about looking at Global South. And so, in fact, even after the selection, most of us said Thailand looks like an outlier because when you look at the dynamics in Thailand and then compared to these other African countries that were selected for this particular project, we anticipated that we are going to come up with some of these kind of drastic differences because if you look at the dynamics, they are not the same. Whilst we are talking of more internal, Thailand is more of a cross-border, which has to do more with international issues and those things. But one thing I wanted to chip in has to do with, you see, in all these things, we also need to look at the geopolitics around the whole story of migration. Okay, so if you look at some of the policies that Diogo was talking about, if you look at the ECOWAS protocol, you look at various country-specific policies on migration and climate change, even within the African continent, you realize that we still speak more of international migration. And I think we more or less have been moved towards that direction because of the geopolitics around migration. Nobody even wants to talk more about South-South migration. So migration between Ghana, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and those things. It's about Ghana to Europe, Ghana to North America. But the numbers don't support that. Okay, the numbers don't support that. And from the studies that we have done and from the Habitable project and those things, we also need to go back into looking at some of these things, especially those looking at the policy aspects and actually look into it, whether these policies are really addressing the issues within the continent that probably we want to really make some kind of changes within these kind of countries. Because for me, it doesn't really look at the critical migration issues that we have in these specific countries. And that is something that we really need to pay attention to. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there is one question in the chat, right?
It was just about the list of countries. I will answer it.
Okay.
Perhaps I could ask a question that is a bit more generally, just a curiosity. I was wondering, this is a question for both speakers. I was wondering when you were speaking, if by any chance you saw some evidence of people that were interested in migrating on their own, like for whatever reason, like economic, education, whatever. And perhaps because of some climate related phenomena, were less likely to migrate. Like perhaps they had fewer resources because there were droughts or whatever, and therefore were less able to pursue their plans of migrating. Or maybe they went ahead with it anyways, but that whatever climate event made it a bit harder for them.
I don't know if you want, Diogo, you want me to pick it first, but from the quantitative analysis, yes, there is data that will allow us to be able to look at some of these things, even though is not an area that I have currently explored. So I can't speak much to that. Yes, the inclination to migrate, there are questions that we ask about that. All the hazard issues are also there. And it's just an issue of us running the data to see whether these things really play out in the data set. But I haven't done that, so I cannot speak to that at the moment.
Yeah, this is something that we are actually doing at the moment. So we have our data set and we subset the data to try to capture all these different nuances when it comes, okay, like the linkages like environmental hazards and capabilities to move or not. So this is something that maybe I can get your contact and get back to you like in a couple of weeks. But this is also of our interest to get to know like how like interviewees like handle with this.
Great, thank you very much for that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think we have to close the discussion sessions for now, but we'll have more moments to open the floor. Now I'll pass the floor to our colleagues from Sapienza University of Roma, Dr. Pier Francesco Breccia, correctly said, and Gianfranco Nucera, who will be providing a broader perspective on international level and EU level policies. So we'll start with Dr. Breccia, who will share some findings on what are some of the core elements in the international legal and policy narratives on migration and displacement.
So thank you, Mary, and good morning, everyone. So from my part, I'm just going to give you some insights on the legal and policy narrative on climate human mobility. Because as we all know, the narrative on human mobility has gained increasing traction, and it is now a global awareness where the environmental impacts had a broader recognition in human mobility. If we go to see reports from leading international institutions, there is like a worrying projection. So by 2050 and so on, there will be hundreds of millions of people moving for, you can go to the next slide, thanks, that are going to leave their places forced to climate change. This narrative is also from the European Union, which recognized the climate human mobility as a governance challenge, not only for the European Union, but for the whole international community. So these predictions sometimes are not very shared by the international community. And this affects the legal and policy narrative, because it's hard to clarify from why the nature of these movements. Whereas in the legal and policy context, this is very important. So now the narrative is getting really refined. We can just see from one example is this 2023 report from the World Bank, which it was the first or maybe one of the most cited projection came exactly from the World Bank, from these hundreds of million people that were moving due to the climate change. But now they are going to refine not so much their data, but how and why people move. So for example, for the first time, or maybe for the first time from the research that we have done, there is the word habitability in the context of climate human mobility. So it means that they are going to restrict to see better how people move and why they move. So if you can choose slide, please, thanks. So this is also the insight that we can see from the Habitable project, where human mobility is not driven only by climate change, it's not driven only by environmental factors, and as we heard before, there are other factors such as economic and social factors. And another things that we can see is that these movements are not that very well defined. So they can be short, they can be internally, they can be also internationally. But this affects the legal and policy aspects that we are going to see. Why? Oh, and just another thing, we have also seen that climate change sometimes restricts mobility and affects most of all the most vulnerable populations. So, but just to go to the first point that we want to highlight, if you can change slides, please. So we can see that there is like a promiscuous use of the terms. So one of the issue is to consider that when we look for migration pathway and how people move, we should also take care of the terminology that we use. Migration and displacement are not the same thing, and this is not something that we say, but if you, for example, look at the UN level, the 2023 Special Rapporteur on climate change and migration affirmed in its report that when he provided a call for inputs to state that to international organizations, he found out that the two terms not only were sometimes confused by states, but they were also confused by international organizations, because sometimes, for example, international organizations can use also other formulation to address these movements. So in the Habitable project, this was like a central point, and we can provide in our document precise or maybe a better understanding of what we define migration, such as voluntary movements of individual and displacement that is more referred to coerced and involuntary movements. So we can see that maybe this is already clear, but sometimes it's better to affirm that this terminology cannot be neutral. So we have to be aware that when we speak about migration, when we speak about internal displacement, we can speak about human mobility. We have to refer not so that much to precise legal framework, but have in mind what rights and duties derive from states and from individuals, that they are aware from their rights. And another point that also is coming out at the UN level is that we have to consider that these movements are sometimes not that stable. They can evolve over time. So it means that we have also to be in mind these distinctions of the applicable, for example, legal framework, because sometimes people are before displaced person, and then they can decide to move and change their legal status from displaced person to migrants. Okay, and this means also to be able to refine the applicable legal framework. So the next slide and the last slide. So what we are going to say is these are not really conclusions, but more a way forward. The way forward is that migration and displacement in the context of climate change is an intricate issue, especially if we look it from the reports and trends that we have so far. There is a narrative, and there is a narrative that sometimes is not that clear from both a legal and policy perspective. And sometimes also these promiscuous use, this use of the terms that is not changes, can also be a weak point for the improvements of legal and policy pathway to be built at international, regional, and national level, because we have to consider all the levels. The last point that we should always also take in mind is that it doesn't matter if these movements are from people that are displaced or that are part of migration pathway. We have also to remember that there is a human rights-based approach that must be improved by states at all levels and all time of crisis that we have to face now and in the future. So thank you, and hope to have a discussion on these points.
Thank you very much, Pier Francesco. I think that's a really nice transition into the intervention of Gianfranco, who will be digging further into this idea of promoting a human rights-based approach to internal displacement policy, whether it's international or internal displacement. So please, Gianfranco, and after hearing from Gianfranco, we'll open the floor again for questions or remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Marie. Hi, everyone. And of course, I'm connecting my brief speech on the point that Pier Francesco raised, because we started from this study and analysis of the international practice. So we deal with treaties, convention, legal framework, policy framework at the international and regional level, but we also paid much attention to the records made by the international institutions, because they can give us some particular perspective on how institutions look at the issue. And we decided to choose to apply to the analysis a human rights-based approach, because we are we think that the human rights-based approach is the only one that can substantiate the interest at stake of individuals, and also the general interest at stake, because we need to use a human rights-based approach as an instrumental lens for looking at the policy evolution. When we talk about human rights-based approach, we're not dealing with abstract issues. We are dealing with standards that are defined in legal norms, standards that are defined by litigation. In the judicial cases, there is a growing evolution of climate litigation, we all know, but in this climate litigation, we always find another brick in the wall, I would say, another piece that help us to construct a comprehensive framework to address the issue. For example, very recently, I look at the Climate Signorina Schweiz case for the European Court of Human Rights, and I noticed with surprise, because the case is all about mitigation policies, but I noticed that the court refer also to adaptation measures that should take into account relevant protection needs and put in place and effectively applied according to the best available science, best available technology, which is a principle recurring in environmental treaties. But it is something that every time we should consider. So the human rights-based approach is fundamental to build something that can respond to the evolution of the situation. We are dealing with different kinds of movement, migration, displacement, other kind of circular mobility. So it's a very complicated, issue. And we also try to add something to the perspective of the Habitable project in the scientific methods, for example, to include an holistic approach that take into account the change of perspective of habitability. For example, habitability was initially conceived like more physical concept related to environmental resources. But during the analysis, of course, we understand that habitability is a more complex concept that deals with socio-economical aspects also. And in this sense, human rights are fundamental. And this is something that starts to be recognized also in legal framework, in reports, as Francesco said, in the World Bank reports, recognized in the judicial case law. For example, we have clear references to uninhabitability since the Kyoto versus New Zealand case before the Human Rights Committee. We have clear references to habitability in the Bill and Others versus Australia. So it is something that is having a broad recognition. And this is important because from habitability, we can derive a set of human rights standards related to right to life, related to right to private family life, related to right to food, housing, education. So this is something very comprehensive to be taken into account. When we look at the legal and policy analysis, generally the main point is the lack of protection, of legal protection for persons who move. But there is something more. We try to change perspective more broadly and looking also to adaptation measures in order not only to look migration as an adaptation strategy. Adaptation can be a measure also to promote human rights, because if you promote adaptive capacity of the population, you can enable people choice of moving or stay. Of course, it depends on the extreme situation, but this is something that we can discuss. Adaptation measures are also increasingly recognizing as a clear obligation in international law, not only in the human rights field, but also in general fields of international law. We have seen recently in another fields of law, before the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, the due diligence obligation of states on climate change. And due diligence is something that we should remember in order to understand the kind of obligation of states. So if you act diligently, you should take into consideration the vulnerabilities of population and then act to protect their needs. And we look also at the, of course, migration framework, which is something very connected to the state sovereignty, because we all know that every state, each country can decide the criteria for admission of persons inside the country, but they are limited in the in some cases by the non-refoulement principle, which is something that not depends on the convention ratified by the state, but it's something general, which apply in all situations, which right to life and right to inhuman and degrading treatment, prohibition, of course, of the inhuman and degrading treatment are at stake. So we have like a broad perspective from the beginning of the possible decision to move, the adaptation, and then after the movement, we notice that after the decision there are two main issues: internal movements, which are related to state decision, and international movements, we refer to another broader legal framework, of course, in case, for example, of regional or international level. In the case of regional level, there are different models. We are free movement agreements, which are, in my personal opinion, the best scenario, but it's something very difficult to apply. And it depends on several issues. It's related to the regional integration, so something also more broad in the scope than the migration framework. And also we have interesting bilateral treaties, which are now developing. I refer particularly to the recent bilateral treaty between Australia and Tuvalu, of course, the Falipili Union Treaty and this cooperation agreement, which allow Australia to give 280 visa for a person coming from Tuvalu each year. This is something to be implemented. So we need to look how this provision will be implemented, but it's something promising. And this is something very related to the specific situation of the Pacific area, and particularly related to the interstate relation between Australia and Tuvalu. So the last and perhaps most important question: if these models are replicable, are they replicable? Well, it depends on several factors. It depends on the area in which they could be replicable. It depends on the interest of states and of the population. If they are population in particularly affected countries or general economic reason for moving. So it depends on very much different situation of the countries. But this is something that is changing, that is evolving, particularly in the last 2 years, I think. It's something very concrete that we should look at and try to understand if this could be a model also for a more broad, comprehensive approach at the international level, not only at the regional level. So I just want to make a quick reference on the national instrument, because of course we also check national level in order to understand practice of states also internally. And we find also promising provision, for example, Peruvian law, which is the first example of definition of climate migrants. It's something very, very difficult to define because of the specific differences that each person can bring with the climate reason. And we notice, of course, different approaches because some states prefer to deal with anticipatory movements. For example, the Argentinian visa that in May 2022 have been established for countries of Central America, or other countries prefer to deal with a mobility after an extreme events, climate extreme events, for example, using forms of temporary protection, which is also, I should say, a kind of measure that is not a durable solution, but it is something that can grant the protection of rights in a specific situation. So also, I think that is a good practice to have this kind of temporary protection. And I think that can start here and looking for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gianfranco, for this, again, very rich presentation. We'll take a moment, 10 minutes maybe, or depending on how much you want to discuss, to open the floor for questions and remarks. People online, please feel free to take part in the discussion as well. Just raise your hand and we'll give you the floor. And then we'll have a break after that.
Can I ask for the floor?
Please go ahead, Francesco.
Sorry, because I apologies for not being able to be physically with you today because I'm jumping from a meeting to another meeting. I followed the last interventions and I couldn't find how to raise the hand in the system. Sorry about that. I just wanted to have a brief reaction so I'm the head of the Migration and Force Displacement Unit in Directorate General International Partnerships of the European Commission. And so I wanted to make a brief intervention just to rapidly react to some of the points that have been made and the findings that could be already made accessible to us, and in the understanding that more will come, and also to share with you some information on where we are heading as the European Commission, and notably the Directorate General for International Partnership on this matter. I think I try to be really brief and focused. Many things have been already said, and also information has been already shared on what we are doing. But I would like to maybe 2-3 main points. Let's say, first of all, I think it's clear, if it's not been said clearly enough, I would like to restate it, that all the topic is already of great importance for the European Union, for the European Commission. So it's not new. We are on this since many years. We have already developed policies. We have launched measures. We are rather in an implementation phase, not in a phase in which we are thinking about whether engage or not, or to raise our awareness. All this is, I would say, think a little bit of the past. Already we have the first papers on this more than 10 years ago. We have escalated even more our attention on that in recent years, because also triggered also, I mean, this kind of facts help of the EU presidency of the Platform for Disaster Displacement that ended last year. It lasted 1 year and a half, and we continue to be very much involved into the work of the PDD. Of course, we are already addressing this point in the discussion at the COP. We have already launched a number of projects and actions interconnected also with those of the member states in such a good quantity that allowed us to have an important pledge at the Global Refugee Forum that took place in December. And I would say we are also struggling very much, but already managing in a way not to work in a silos manner. We are international partnerships, so working in third countries other than the neighborhood, but we are very well connected also with DG NEAR, with DG Home, DG Clima, and plenty of others, and DG ECO, of course, because the nexus is at the center of our work, I would say. And also we are operating at global scale, because we started my unit itself, I mean, several years ago, already in having projects, for example, in the Pacific region. And now we are escalating because we have, I'm really want to use the word escalating, because we are launching 100 million euro project, for instance, should be rather called program, for instance, in southern part of Africa, in the southern parts of Asia. We have also a project of global nature with the IDMC in various countries around the globe. We can select them, but we have decided already to focus on the Pacific, small Pacific island countries: Bangladesh, Vietnam, Nigeria, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Guatemala, and the Caribbean group. So just to say, we are already there, and indeed it's time already to start trying delivering. Second concept, delivering what? What's the approach? What are trying to do? I mean, various things, because on migration, there is a number of things that are addressing the root causes, at the same time trying to manage migration, including also supporting migrants, refugees, and their host countries. And on climate, there is a number of initiatives that are part of the Green Deal, the external dimension of the Green Deal. So in the middle, there is indeed a huge work in the context of addressing the impact on migration and displacement of climate change and environmental degradation, because we are also mindful that a natural disaster, because indeed it's not just about climate change, it's broader than that. And we are very much also, I would say, in line with the idea of to think in a broader sense as habitability. I would say that's clear. I mean, it's also about, it's also very much connected with a number of other factors. I mean, the war, the capacity of the state, of national local authorities to deliver on public services, and manage, for instance, public services, water, for its adduction, is crucial. And must be done in a specific manner in fragile areas, and so on and so forth. So what are we trying to do? Essentially, after a number of talks and messaging, creating a little bit of dramatic narrative on the consequences, so arrival of millions, what Europe is going to do. I mean, yeah, all this is in the perspective, but our work is rather concentrated on the prevention and the strengthening the resilience, in the raising awareness, therefore, on the problems, in giving the instruments and the tools to predict, to prevent. So, in that respect, the work of, for instance, of a research like the one of Habitable is very interesting. Goes in exactly in the direction we're working in, and the findings are useful, of course, in a granular manner. I mean. It's also difficult to digest in one shot. So they must be located then in the different situation where we are operating. Because basically what we are trying to do is to help populations to, and authorities, of course, to organize themselves in the best possible manner, to resist, to become more resilient, to prevent. In any case, to give people the possibility also to have a choice. We are absolutely aware of the fact that migration is part of the response, can be a solution. Nobody is against migration. Migration is a key tool to fight against poverty, to fight against inequality. So we are not against migration. Migration must be a choice. Of course, it's a big word, the choice. When you are really squeezed under different, very harsh natural and political factors, it can be just a word, the choice. But it's important to maintain, to help the population and communities to keep the larger possible space of resilience and therefore of a choice. And that's where we are heading, where we are putting our best tools. Of course, in some cases, we need to accompany population that cannot resist, that don't want to resist any longer. But in most of the cases, this is well known. In that case, it's almost rather the displacement word to be used. Is not transcontinental, is rather most frequently in the same country, in any case, in the adjacent areas. So we should also be mindful also of the connection, and we are, with the topic of the IDPs, and we are also closely working with Robert Piper, the UN Secretary General advisor, a special advisor on these matters, because in most of the cases it's about, let's say, accompanying the transfer of communities in the neighborhood. Trying to avoid also that all this produce just a pressure on mega cities that in the south part of the world are growing in an uncontrolled manner. The third concept I would like to mention is how to all this impacts on the legal framework. This is a matter that is a little bit broader than my specific mandate and work as a DG INPA. DG INPA is the former DG DEFCO, for those who are familiar with the jargon of Brussels. So we are specialized in the cooperation, actually development cooperation with the third countries. We are not in charge of defining policies and legal framework of the EU on migration matters. But we, of course, we participate to the debate on how this framework should be and notably in its external dimension. And what I can say is that I think clearly there is no appetite, but also reason to change the Geneva Convention on Refugees because all these matters are different and new. Eventually, additional frameworks or specific frameworks can be considered, and in part, let's say the brilliant added value of that brought the PDD, the Platform for Disaster Displacement, as a follow-up to the Nansen initiative, was indeed to protect, to create a protection framework for those displaced by climate change into transnational manner, so across the board. And solutions of this kind, I mean, or related to that, are also welcome in a transnational manner. I mean, humanitarian visas for those who want to use this tool, and that's more important, within the country, because again, it's not about you that should do this or that. In most of the cases, it's about all countries in the world that should be prepared to also give a specific attention and treatment and protection to their own citizens that will be displaced by these movements. It's relatively rare to have persons that cross continents in order to search protection elsewhere, although, of course, it may happen, and our member states, in some cases, are already more reactive than one could think. But the very idea to put in question the Geneva Convention on Refugees is certainly, for what we can see, not of the appetite of the member states. And frankly, it could be also very dangerous in a phase like this, where even the adherence to the Geneva Convention itself is sometimes put in question by many. Let's also be reminded that plenty of countries in the world have not even signed or ratified the Geneva Convention on Refugees. So we should be mindful of having a balanced approach on the matter, not to create tension where are not necessarily interested. But of course, there is a debate on that, and we also are going to discuss this with the member states if they want to address the matter. But as I said, more important is to stress the importance to create protection frameworks, and in the case of specific assistance to those that within the countries on a transnational manner are already obliged to search for a better future or are openly displaced. That's for instance typically the case for natural disasters, where really oblige people to in a minute to move. While when it comes to climate change and environmental degradation, it's more of a slow motion. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to argue for a specific protection framework. I mean, because it's confused with economic migration, sometimes also with wars and other matters. So I think in a nutshell, that's what I wanted to say. But I would like to reiterate that indeed, studies like the one of Habitable and the specific findings that they can produce, when they are granular enough, are very welcome and very useful. We are already very present, so the studies must be as much as possible tuned with the work ongoing. There is a specific interlocutor within the European Commission that can help bridging studies with operations, and this is the Joint Research Center based in Ispra that is already very fluent in studies on the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on migration and displacement. Indeed, in any case, we need to, it's not really much the time to procure evidence that the problem exists. We are all very much aware of that, but rather to indeed be more granular in identifying things that are in motion or at risk and that requires solutions. So also the study of solutions is very important. Sometimes solution can be also of a practical nature to help communities to better manage water, to handle the fields and the crops in a different manner, to organize also the use of financial resources in a smarter manner. We also try to also work in that direction to orientate the mentalities. For instance, we are planning to have projects pushing also the use of remittances, migrant remittances, for climate resilience projects in the rural area to have test case. We have worked on that with IFAD, for instance. So it's really important. It's a phase in which it's important to be granular, to be attentive to what can be done, not just to demonstrate that the problem exists, and to be sharply focusing on specific situations. Indeed, to come down to the earth and be linked to the work in specific countries and situation. The EU is present all over the world with its own delegations, but of course, as a point of entry, my unit within the GINPA is absolutely very interested and able to represent an interlocutor. Of course, the research and the operations are sometimes having different timing, different also capacities, but indeed it's very important that we have and we maintain this link. I stopped there, and sorry I was sorry again for not being there with you, and not all the time, because unfortunately I will have also to leave relatively soon. But many thanks also for the intervention and for this very promising study. And I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for your extensive intervention. It really felt like you were with us in the room, so no regret on that front. And I think it was really insightful. This means that time is out for this discussion session, but I think that's all good.
May I add something? I want to thank Francesco for this intervention, because it's very clear, and of course we are aware of the intervention of the policies of the European Union on these of the study that made the European Union since the 90s of the last siege. But we of course never said that a possible solution would be to amend the Refugee Convention. No, this is not the. We perfectly agree with you, because it will be something very difficult and very sensitive, and it will broad protection, not in a just way. So I will say that for this reason, we are looking for alternative, complementary solution in order to grant something, a kind of protection to this person. We contest the use of climate refugee, which is not the term to be used in this case. So this is our view. We are perfectly in line with your message. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gianfranco. So we'll stop here for this session, but there will be again more opportunities, especially for those in the room, to engage for the rest of the morning. So we'll invite you to the breakfast session.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for all the participants, for all the people that's following online, and for all the panelists. We are now going to take a 15-minute break, coffee break, and we'll continue with session 2 entitled EU Approaches and Integrating Habitable Findings, which also will be recorded for later distribution.
Just maybe the break is downstairs where you were in the morning, so it can be a bit confusing because there is a break area here, but it's not for us, so we're not able to touch that food.
They do enforce it strictly because I have fallen on the wrong side.
Don't touch other people's food, and you can go downstairs. You get everything coffee and snacks.
So, as you know, they are both consultants at Adelphi, and they will present current EU narratives around climate change and migration, as well as key active policy process. Emily, Toby.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Hopefully feeling revived and ready after the coffee break for another session. My name's, as Sergio just said, Emily Rangel-Kelly. I'm an advisor in the climate policy program at Adelphi. We're a think tank based in Berlin, and we work on a range of issues to do with climate, sustainable development, etc. So in this session, the plan is to take everything that we talked about in the first session, you know, a bit about the Habitable project now and what we're interested in, what kind of findings we're generating, and to really discuss how these findings might be most relevant and useful to your work going forwards. But before we dive into that, a bit more detail with my colleague Toby, we thought we'd kick off the session with just and prime the discussion a bit with a short foray into the scenarios work that we've been doing in the project. This work obviously complements the empirical work where we've really been trying to understand what are the conditions on the ground right now, and we think about and go into the uncertainties surrounding future climate-related migration. obviously we know there are many factors that could influence this, not least how effective we are in supporting those affected communities on the ground. So I think it's a good segue into getting into more detail about the policies. Now, our work is just one of the, obviously when we're talking about scenarios, it's not about predicting the future, but really thinking about what could plausibly happen and using those scenarios to then shape strategic planning and adaptation. Our work is just one of the approaches looking at the future in the project. There's also a team that is running quantitative models, looking at future migration patterns and trying to forecast future disaster displacement risks at a regional and international level. And we also have one of the empirical work packages is really looking at lots of detail at individual decision-making processes, and they also want to run scenarios with that data. What we've done is we really want to complement this big picture quantitative work by looking more at the communities, and what we've developed is 2 sets of qualitative scenario narratives that are focused on the communities where the Habitable project has been engaged. So in those 5 countries, Ghana, Mali, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Thailand. Next slide. So the way, as I said, we've done 2 sets of scenarios to kind of explore how habitability may change in the future. The first set is a set of crisis scenarios where the premise is that there's a major climate shock in the year 2030. And we encouraged, in the process of creating them, we really tried to think about what are the sources of vulnerability and resilience before that would make people either vulnerable or resilient to the shock, and what might happen afterwards. And we created those scenarios for Mali, Ethiopia, and Ghana. They're set more in the present day, and the shock is in 2030. And the idea is then that in looking at these scenarios, maybe there's the scope to look at existing policies and contingency plans and to think, okay, how are they adequate? Is there something more that we could do? The second set of scenarios is a set of aspirational features. They're not utopian. They still assume that there's a medium to high emissions scenario in these countries, because obviously the countries that we're talking about in Habitable Project don't have a lot of influence over global emissions. But they're aspirational in the sense that we assume a robust adaptation response and decisive action that makes migration really an effective strategy to cope with and adapt to future climate change conditions. And the idea here is that they're set much further in the future. They're set in 2050, and that we create a vision of what a habitable future would look like at that time, what a desirable future might look like at that time inside its worsening. So the idea here is not forecasting as often done in scenarios, but rather backcasting. Where do we want to go? And then what might be the steps that would take us to that future? And we're hoping that this is a useful way of framing our discussion that we're coming up with now. You might ask how we came up with the scenarios, just very briefly. We took a really extensive look at the literature. We had workshops and interviews to come up with a conceptual model to underpin the scenario building. But actually, the actual scenarios were developed in a co-creation process with the country teams from the Habitable Project, each country and other experts in a kind of workshop format, and then an iterative process following that. What form do they take? There's obviously going to be a report. There's always a report. But we also wanted to have a format that was more engaging for non-expert audiences. So the scenarios are also communicated in a series of animated videos where we imagine that there's one person in this community talking about their life. And I'd like to share one of these videos with you now. It's the story of Faith in Makueni County in Kenya, and talking about what might be a desirable future for her and her family and her community. And maybe this gives us some ideas then for the ensuing discussion of, okay, well, what are the roles of our different organizations in maybe making faith streams become a reality? So if you can run the video, Toby.
My name is Faith. I'm 18 years old and from a village in Makueni County. It's the year 2030, and here on my family's small farm, we've had to deal with terrible drought the last few years. My parents have had to make a lot of changes to deal with the lack of rain. Now, we grow cowpeas instead of beans, as they can grow without much water. And they also sold some of our animals so we could afford fertilizer and the more drought-resistant maize varieties. It was a hard choice to sell them, but we have to use fertilizer and these expensive seeds now, or nothing grows. It's not possible for us to get loans from the bank as we don't officially own our land. Our neighbors are doing a bit better. Their son has gone to work in Mombasa like some of my friends. He sends money back now that he's training as a carpenter. But my parents need my younger brother to help on the farm and want me to complete my education so that I have different opportunities. I'm now finishing school and have always wanted to become a teacher. With more bursaries available, I applied and was fortunate to receive one. Now, I can focus on my studies without worrying about affording school fees, books, or materials. I can now go to university to follow my dream to become a teacher. The year is 2050 and 10 years ago, I moved back to my village to work in the local school. It's good to be home, especially now that my parents are getting older, and I'm proud to raise my kids here. The county government made it easier to get title deeds, and that helped my parents and brother to get loans from the bank. The loans made it possible to pay for technology to get the most out of the rain we get and better access the water we have. The droughts are still bad, but we have gotten better at anticipating and managing them. I've always wanted to move home and give back to my community. Aside from the teaching, we can do a lot through the school. The last years we've had a tree planting drive, for example. Being a teacher gives me purpose and allows me to provide opportunities for the children to thrive in our village.
Yeah, this video picks up on a lot of the themes that we've heard about through our data that we've heard from the communities, that they want self-empowerment through access to credit and education. Also a strong attachment to place. A lot of people don't really want to leave. Like, the aspiration is that they want to be able to return home and be in the communities, and for that to be made possible. I could go on, but I think we should get into the policy discussion. But I just wanted to say that we'll share the link to all of these scenarios and a bit more information after the workshop. And just to also say that we try to also bring them back to the communities by having them voiced in local languages, so they're also in the communities. And now over to my esteemed colleague, Toby.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Toby. I'm also an advisor in Delphi working on human mobility and the intersection with climate policy. And just to give you a quick agenda of what I'll briefly talk about, I'll give you a quick overview of EU policies and positions, and then some examples of EU research tools, instruments, and projects, then try to derive where the focus is in those positions and tools, and then look at how this aligns with what we're seeing in the Habitable project, and then how this then translates into preliminary takeaways for policymakers, both EU and beyond. And then we're going to move into our discussion afterwards, where we'll break into two groups and kind of pick at it a little bit more and see how we can take all this information that you've heard today and arrive at some kind of ideas and recommendations that we'll feed into our final reports that will then make their way back to all of you. Right. And I have a tough task of kind of very quickly giving an overview of what the EU is doing, but also then trying to summarize everything that you've heard today and bringing it all together. So bear with me. So I'm not going to go into all of these papers. This is just to give an overview. And that there is kind of has been a lot of policies and positions at the human mobility and climate change nexus for a long time now. It goes back even further than this, but this is just in the last 10 or so years. And starting in 2013 to 2016, there was a kind of a recognition on the humanitarian focus that started more to recognize the links between migration, environmental degradation, and climate change. And then a shift to how this also relates to resilience and self-reliance for displaced populations. Then with 2017, then we start to see more of the narrative migration as adaptation. That migration can be an effective adaptation strategy. And then, as Francesco Luciani mentioned, with the EU chairmanship of PDD, we had this kind of main first working document that really explicitly talked about displacement, migration, environmental degradation, climate change coming out in 2022. This has been further complemented by, for example, the joint communication on the climate security nexus that came out last year, which provided a basis for integrating all these different work streams that are all sort of touching on the same topics and need to be brought further together, and in an effort then to also make sure that they are working effectively together. So kind of overall, the EU's policy evolution from 2013 to the present shows kind of a clear progression from recognizing the impacts of climate change on migration to integrating climate resilience, adaptation, and security into a unified strategy. And this progression demonstrates an increased understanding and complexity in tackling the connection between human mobility and environmental degradation and challenges. And as we heard Francesco mention as well, it's not new. There's also, in addition to all the policies and positions, lots of measures, and that we're in an implementation phase now. So could you go to the next slide, please? So then this is really a very basic overview, but there's funding instruments from the big NDC mechanism to Team Europe initiatives on climate change adaptation and resilience. Then we also heard Francesco mention the EU SADC partnership and lots of different disaster risk reduction support programs in different ways. There's research, habitable, of course, no introduction needed there, but also cascades, looking at cascading factors and how cross-border challenges affect other countries, for example, Ukraine-Russia war, grain shortages, what this impact then has on Africa, and further projects like CLICAM and MAGIC. There's also lots of data and analysis. So we heard from the JRC earlier in online, and they have a lot of great tools. There's the global conflict risk index that looks a lot of these different factors and tries to bring them together also into then informing delegations, member states, and different EU bodies on how to make decisions based on different environmental impacts and risk factors. Of course, there's also international partnerships such as with UNEP and IOM, and many smaller scale projects. I learned of one that the FPI is implementing last week that in Somalia that also brings in a lot of these different nexus topics and very much aligns with the recommendations and research that we have in the Habitable project. So next slide. So right, where's the focus? So in looking at all these documents and policies and tools, the things that are emerging at the very top is averting disaster. So averting disaster and climate-related displacement where possible, and minimizing its impact, and then strengthening adaptation in the process. And then another thing emerging is policy and programming coherence. Then kind of bringing all these things together, like I mentioned with the nexus topics, how we link humanitarian action, development partnerships, environmental policy, mainstreaming, all these kind of coherence things that we spoke about earlier in terms of horizontal coordination. Of course, supporting multilateralism and leadership at COPs. Security is a big thing, and traditionally it was more militarily, securing the border, making sure that international migration is managed in a secure way. But now, with recent documents, there's also an increased shift towards integrating a human security approach, not just defense, but also generally what it means for humans to be secure. And then this is coming into the language as well. And yeah, international migration is, of course, a big focus. Next slide. So, yeah, we see this aligning with the findings that we have in the project in a few ways. So environmental shocks as drivers of migration, maybe not one as a causal thing, but a correlation. And then that there's a complex interplay of factors, and that gender plays a role in migration decisions. And a few kind of food for thought things on how Habitable can contribute to EU policies. So just that maybe sometimes it's a little too big picture, and that broader geopolitical and security concerns can lead to kind of overlooking local nuanced level factors. And that migration is not only an adaptation tool, but it can also be maladaptation if there aren't sustainable development policies in place that kind of support migration as an adaptation strategy. And the role of perception, which I'll, I think, get into on the next slide anyways. So, and you've heard about it today. Right. So we wanted to already kind of pull out a few recommendations, and this is building on all the presentations you've heard today and from other partners who weren't able to make it today. And we wanted to bring some recommendations that go kind of beyond let's have a nexus approach, let's do multilateral initiatives, horizontal, vertical coordination and coherence. And we're not saying these aren't important, but these are, well, of course, important and need to be followed. But in addition, there's room to integrate things like new approaches to modeling responses to environmental shocks. So integrating the role of perceptions, what's true is subjective, and that climate impacts are not deterministic, so that what we heard from Francois, for example, social tipping points are highly context specific. So people might be leaving before climate thresholds are reached and might be staying after climate thresholds are reached, and people define their own thresholds, and this is very context specific. And this may seem obvious, like if you think about kind of climate impacts that we have in Europe, you think about, for example, extreme heat, wildfires, flooding in Germany 2 years ago. They affect people, but people are mostly fine and resilient afterwards, and they're not leaving their homes, they're rebuilding because they had this kind of community and resiliency. Then also to make sure that intersectionality is also included in modeling and risk assessments, and that, you know, different kind of risk factors add up and compound, and that this is accounted for in the modeling. So not only integrating migration as adaptation, but also making sure that migration is embedded in a way that enhances choices, where, when, and how, and safety. And this kind of relates to what we heard from our colleagues from Sapienza. So yeah, generally supporting adaptive capacities will increase choice and safety of migration pathways. And it's not only that migration is a good adaptation strategy, it's only a good adaptation strategy if there's supportive policies in place to enable that as well. Then I would also encourage all policymakers to think about the translocal approaches. So we're not just thinking about like origin areas or destination areas separately, but that this is one kind of unit of analysis. This is a family, this is one person moving, and then they're going to a destination area, and then the links between these two, and making sure that there is kind of like an awareness that policies in one place and impact outcomes in both, and then also including transit as well. And then finally, maybe this is also a little obvious, but sustainable development is good migration policy. So we saw in the faith video that, you know, education policy can lead to better migration outcomes. Economic policy, of course, this is the main thing that we've seen coming out of the project, that people are making decisions based on. And then strengthening resiliency and increasing coping capacity, providing public goods. And this is something that I was struck by in the FPI project in Somalia, that they created the infrastructure of a local market. And then this market meant that people didn't have to travel further to sell their goods. They could stay locally. This then created further social resiliency, community, environment around this space, and reduced the need to migrate out. So there wasn't a need for migration as adaptation because there was the provision of public goods. And the EU is already doing this, but this is something that could explicitly be scaled and integrated. And then I just added this point during the discussion earlier, but that language is really important, and making sure that it's not enough to say, okay, we are taking action on climate change and human mobility when most of that action is only related to disaster risk reduction, because then this is kind of action on climate change and displacement, or climate change and planned relocation or forced displacement. But when we're talking about climate or environmental degradation and human mobility, that this includes migration, especially thinking about sustainable development, local internal migration, and that the policies and the language also then reflects this. I think I'll leave it at that, and then just briefly talk about the discussion. So this is why we invited you all here today. We want to hear from you, and we want to reflect on the things that we heard. So we have some questions here that we're going to leave on the board, and we want to now split into two groups. I think we're like pretty balanced in terms of people sitting on both sides of the table. So I don't know if we want to just cut it right down the middle, unless there's any like objections or something. And then we could have one group go to the back, and then yeah, we would take maybe like a moment to read the questions and then just start talking about them. It doesn't have to be in order. If you have like immediate thoughts, there can be also other things you want to bring up. But the idea is that we want to have a discussion that then feeds into recommendations that then go back to all of you. So we have some ideas about what our recommendations are and will be, but we're hoping that this can provide new information and fine tune them, and yeah, also hear something that we did. Thank you.
And we will now also say goodbye to the participants who have been following online.
Yes,
right?
true. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
We thank your participation.
All right.
So which half, right?
So like if we cut the table in half, then everybody on this
Thank you.
But we can
but I send you recommendations to what's about the